Hello. In this podcast, I will talk about Marxism and, more pointedly, the idea expressed in that famous sentence: Marxism was never tried, comrade. Anybody who had any kind of encounter with intellectual Marxism, not merely with Marxism is in practice, have heard this sentence. And this sentence is usually ridiculed as something that has absolutely no grounds in reality. It's a kind of an attempt to escape reality of Marxist principles that always yield totalitarian society. I would like to remedy this just a bit. Namely, in my opinion, which I think even can be demonstrated, Marxism is totalitarian. Marx's political theory, or better to say philosophy in general, leads to totalitarian conclusion, and there is no escaping that. But societies that developed on the, or better to say, that have been imposed upon so-called Marxist principles are not really congruent with his idea, that is to say, with his motives and the principles that stemmed from these motives, from the analysis of what is in fact human condition, not so much from economy originally. Excuse me. Those who know about Marx will be aware of that, but I'll just mention it for those who don't know. Marx's philosophical writings became available to public mass only in 20th century. In 19th century, he was mostly known by his political economy and political analysis and politico-economical theory laid down in Das Kapital, but there were other writings, other things he wrote that were more philosophical, let's call them, in a very strict sense of Hegelian philosophy, post-Hegelian philosophy of the mid-19th century. He was, as is known, from the group called young Hegelians. The problems that were brought forward in his philosophy are problems that are very highly localized ones. They are, to a large extent, even the problems of the Prussian state, because his analysis is in fact always an attempt to interpret Hegel. He remained Hegelian to his last breath. It is highly arguable whether the principles acquired in this way can be applied universally. Never mind whether they are wrong or right. They are localized. Now, what I mean by this will be made clear, I think, best if I just lay them out. What is the main main problem for Marx. Believe it or not, the main problem for Marx, in a political sense, is originally the existence of religion and inability of religion to serve its function in political community. I don't say society on purpose, because society, so-called civil society and political community are not only not the same in Marx's view, but are alienated. And the main problem, the main problem of Marxism is Versöhnung, Hegelian term, the reconciliation of these two. And Marx, of course, believed, he's from Rhineland, from Trier, but a part of his life was spent in Berlin, and in Berlin he really formed his ideas and got in touch with other young Hegelians and started his revolutionary career. So, because as I believe, as we can point out, just that Germany was not unified at that time, but was the conglomerate of states, principalities, and so on and so forth. Prussia was considered one of the, rightly so, one of the strongest, but also in some opinions as the one of the most enlightened in a way, and other opinions one of the most conservative. Never mind. Hegel's philosophy, more pointedly Hegel's philosophy of right, his main, let's say, political book, concluded that Prussian state is the embodiment of objective idea, that it is the model of the perfect state that can provide Versöhnung, reconciliation of the contradictions that are inherent in human societies. Of course, Marx was not satisfied with this. So why religion? First, let's see what is alienated. In Hegel's view, there are two components or halves of the society. One is the bürgerliche Gesellschaft. The other is politische Gemeinschaft. That is to say, the civil society and political community. The trouble with them is that they are in dialectical relation. Civil society is they are both built upon a purpose, or their final cause, what they are for. The civil society is a society of private individuals. Hegel considered French Revolution to be an uncompleted endeavor that went awry to an extent, because it pointed out, as in this Declaration of Rights and Citizen, precisely rights of such private men, without doing the development of the rights of political men and duties, because politics is more about duties than private life in civil society. So what civil society consists of? It consists of family, it consists of job, vocation. At that time it was either free enterprise, nascent development of the mass free enterprise practicing individuals, civil service, and so on and so forth. Everything that has to do with your, mine, or your life, regardless, not entirely regardless, but without essential relation to a communal life as society, as state. Because in Hegel, state, moreover nation state, is the real subject of history. Everything has to in the end be developed into a nation state, to feel the rationality, political rationality, the spirituality, in fact, because in Hegel, a spirit is the Geist, that's Geist, is a secular, a kind of secular God. And this is very important. I'll get back to it, I hope. Geist is, in Hegel, human, but something more than human at the same time. And this contradiction he was not able to resolve, and that brought about philosophies as Marx and from Feuerbach, or Bruno Bauer and others, that turned Hegel's idealism at one instance into absolute materialism, because it was inherent in this contradiction. But we'll get back to it, as I said. So this state has to reconcile civil society, which I just described, with political community. Political community is built upon mainly on the purposes of certain people, or purposes of the state that are making it a historical subject, that are regulating, or rather leading to its rightful place in the world. For something like this, you have to be more than private individual. Everything you do in politics, you do for public good, in fact, for public, not interest. That's something that leftists in our day and age like to use, public interest or general interest, common interest. Don't think that combination of words works at all. Anyway, and how to reconcile this? In Marx's view, for instance, ancient polis was, with all its economical contradictions he loves to point out, was such a form of political community where there is no difference between private and public individual. You are both. You are identified with your polis. Germans tended to have this semi-romantic view on Greeks, a very dangerous thing with Germans. They like to read their own standpoint into Greek culture. Romantics loved. In the Middle Ages, that was something that Romantics loved to do. By the way, Marx was very much influenced by Romanticism. Marx was a guy that was a product of this Bildung, the education, the Germany of that time, post-German idealism. And I think that's very often forgot. There are components of that in his philosophy that are very strong. Which makes it a kind of materialistic idealism, if that makes any sense to you. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's what we got. So, how to reconcile these two? These two are reconciled in religion for Hegel. Because religion as a first instance of laying aside this self-interest of civil man, of bourgeois, in fact, whom Marx hated. He was one of them for the whole of his life, in every sense of the word. And the member of political community, let's say German. Religion does this in a figure of not any religion, but one religion, Protestant Christianity, which in Hegel's view developed Innerlichkeit, the innerness. This means that God is met inside without the need of the church, in the sense the Catholic Church is a church. You can have churches, you can't have church. You can't have what they call this in Hegel's and Schelling's time, and Kierkegaard, positive Christianity. Positive Christianity is the Christianity that has these dogmas, laws, and they don't. Well, in a sense that traditionally existed, it is an error, something that leads in historical dead end. What they meant was that, what Hegel meant, is that this Innerlichkeit can find its expression in a state. And what state, in turn, has to offer to individual, this is necessary, is institutionalization of this Innerlichkeit, of this Christianity or this religion, which makes its institutions Christian, but not in the Catholic sense, not in the Muslim sense, not in the Orthodox sense. This is maybe even not in a Protestant sense, in maybe some original sense of this word, but in the sense of Protestant philosophy of that age, Hegel's philosophy. And indeed, the religion, and although there were not Protestant clerics, there were Protestant clerks. It became the office of the state. And Marx's criticism of Hegel is that this does not, religion does not accomplish this task. And he was here influenced by two men, Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach is more famous as Marx is influenced, but Bruno Bauer is also important because in that time in Germany there was this push of so-called criticism, critical theology, or Bible criticism, scriptural criticism. And let us not forget these are dominantly Protestant states, where it was attempted to show, to in fact adjust Christianity to modernity. The whole philosophy of German idealism, especially Hegel's, is an attempt to create philosophy and indeed culture that retains connection to origins, to antiquity and Middle Ages, but adjusts it to modernity, which is completely contradictory, which is impossible, in fact. What they yielded is Soviet Union, China, Nazi Germany. That's my opinion. I just cut the long story short. That's what they got from their attempt. But at that time, at the beginning, it seemed like a great idea, and I think it was, I'm sure it was great time to be a student in the early 19th century Berlin or Vienna, but it didn't last long until implications started to develop in a very ugly way. Anyway, so the criticism was, to cut the long story short, that person of Christ is an abstraction. Where is that Christ? It moves everybody towards one person that is not present, instead of the other persons that are present. Now I'm talking about, in fact, about Feuerbach, whose idea Marx to a large extent accepted. For Feuerbach, who was dead set Hegelian and then turned into the absolute critic of Hegelian, political society, political community was what is originally where the idea of God comes from. God is another you, because projected in the infinity instead where its place is to another man, because for Feuerbach, human being is a species being, Artswesen. that is being species. Being means being that is defined by this communal nature. It cannot exist without community, because it cannot fulfill its needs all by itself, and has gender. Two genders cannot be one. It's very interesting, which is in fact is true, but he's separating this from other parts of truth, of course. And now this came at the fertile ground made by people like Bauer or what was his name? David Strauss, the people who wrote about, were theologians, and by the way, Hegel was also a theologian, Protestant theologians. They try to show that, for instance, Gospels are just stories that are expression of people's spirit, of Jewish people's spirit of that age, that found put forward ideals. Jesus didn't exist, or he did exist, but it was not important. They were creating mythology. Mythology in Germany is very important. The German idealism was an attempt, according to its first outline by presumably Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, so-called first fragment of Deutsche Idealismus, of German idealism, the creation of rational mythology, or new mythology for the new age. That was one of the purposes. One of the purposes of this purpose is to have political system, in fact. This is what they need mythology for. And now this is where Marx finds religion at lack and religion to be an enemy, because as he later developed this opium for the people thing and so on and so forth. This is where it comes from. This is strictly philosophical. We are not talking about economy now, of his analysis of exchange of money, as it wrote in Capital, Das Kapital, later. But this is the essence. And I know that because when I read Capital, Das Kapital, I'm not showing off my ability to say it in German, but when I say capital, it sounds like I'm feeling his personal capital. No, it's a book. Oof, it's a terribly boring book. When you read that, with the knowledge of Marx's background, you understand why work is so important for him. At the first sight, those who don't know philosophy but know classical economy may think that's because classical economy has this work theory of values, had it at that time, which Marx criticizes and puts forward his own work theory of values. But the thing is that what he assumes is Hegel's idea from the Phänomenologie des Geistes, phenomenology of spirit, that work is the first expression of human essence. Because through work, man comes to starts on the true path of reconciliation of him and the world, of subject and object, of consciousness and the thing that is present in consciousness. And through dialectics of master and slave, historical dialectics, comes to an idea that everybody is free. Now, this is a long story. I even talked about this in other contexts. Look for Marx under tags. There is 2-part podcast in which I say quite a lot about this. There's Marx and sustainable development, in which I try to show that sustainable development, this modern, postmodern theory of all, is not Marxist. They like to call it leftist and Marxist, but it's in fact not. But this is important. So Marx takes this Hegelian idea of work as a beginning of the manifestation of human essence and turns it into essence itself. Why? Because there is nothing else beside man. Everything that is invisible, everything that is not, as they would say, concrete, but this does not mean merely material. This is concrete is meant in Hegelian terms. Everything that is not given to be conceptualized in the system, and trust me, no system can hold Jesus Christ, angels, and God, is verboten. It is put out of the game. What remains is the creative nature of man. Man is a being of nature, that Marx would say, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseauian Enlightenment idea, plus, he says at the other point, man is above the nature because man creates itself, no matter, he said that nature creates man. You know, these are contradictions in Marx that Eric Vogelin pointed out and called him a swindler, which he probably was. His motives were not pure theory, his motives were, I think, rather insidious. I cannot prove it, but were in fact practical. So, he would say that. So without practice, theory is good for nothing, without political creation. So what he wants is to reconcile communal political man and private man. And he hates private man, he hates bourgeois, Bürger, because he is the Mangel, as Germans would say, he is obstacle towards realizing true community, and true community is the essence of realizing the species being of man, which is godlike. Not godlike in a post-humanist sense of Americans and British and let's say this part of Western Europe, the post-humanism. It is godlike in a sense of ability to create good, to create truth, such things. Germans tend to be really rooted in this tradition, even they're atheists, which makes them, I would say, even far worse than their Anglo-Saxon counterparts, some of which in that day and age is a historical anachronism called Richard Dawkins. There is nothing dangerous in Dawkins. There is much danger in Marx to this day. And it's no wonder that he's still popular and it still provokes interest. Because he tries to attach himself to sources sources of issues that concern all people, and then distort them, because this is a distortion. You see, this is ability, an attempt to use something real and deviate it into something unreal, in my opinion. So, communist society would be a society that reconciles these things. I'm now, of course, talking about philosophical assumptions. We won't go into economical or political assumptions that led for it to be accepted in places where it really had no grounds to be accepted in Marx theory. Because why Marx, to get back to the beginning and conclude, why I said that he's localized? Well, he's localized because his prediction of revolution is predicated upon politics of Europe of his age, of free countries, namely Germany, France, and England, Great Britain, which is the most economically, industrially developed. There is a reason why he insists that carrier of revolution must be industrial working class. If you don't have industrial working class, you don't have the subject of revolution. Whatever Lenin tried to wriggle in with taking peasantry and uniting it to industrial proletariat. This is a different thing. Marx was localized not only in this sense, as I tried to show, he was localized by philosophy. This German philosophy of 19th century was extremely particular to the time and space where it came about, but had these universalist pretensions that are not really working. There is a lot of what non-German Eastern European, let's call me, could take even then and can take it now from this German philosophy with a critical armor and weapons always at the ready, because this is very dangerous philosophy. Only more dangerous things are what comes after it with Nietzsche and later Heidegger and such people, Oswald Spengler. You know, this is a pretty potent intellectual cocktail, which people don't understand so well now because we are all so pragmatic. Supposedly philosophy and ideas don't play a role in this phase of history. I don't think so. I think we have different, rather opposite situation. But that's a story in itself. Anyway, so it was very localized. This critique of religion is very localized. It has premises, hypotheses, axioms that are not accepted by everybody, and for good reason. I mean, you have these analyses of Gospels, scholarly analysis that turned all those theologians into anti-theologians overnight. You can imagine how strong their faith was to pull this off. Those analyses are not really satisfactory. Those are fables on fables. They have very little to work on as philologists, especially at that time. So they make assumptions and put them as axioms. And it's all built upon that. And Marx's critique of religion is precisely critique of that religion. This doesn't mean that Marx, if faced with a Catholic saint, will become religious. I think Marx was definitely very not only anti-religious, he was anti-God. He was anti-God even in the philosophical sense. He seemed to have a contempt to a lot of things, but spirituality in the real sense of the word being one of them, because I think he considered it a threat to his cosmic professorship that's going into psychology of a dead man, or pneumopathology as Eric Vogelin would call it. So I'll suspend my judgment. Everybody who knows about Marx knows he was a pretty loathsome man. I don't think that this is without influence on his philosophy. But what I wanted to say was precisely this. Something one should know about Marx and Marxism is this. So when they say, comrade, Marxism was never tried, there is some merit to this. But not that much merit that we should consider Marxism as a viable philosophy or politics, rather, because it is anti-philosophy in any sense of the word. Thank you for your attention.